And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Don Seigelman. He's the only politician in Alabama history to hold all the state's top constitutional offices: governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and secretary of state. Alabama's first Catholic governor and the first New South progressive governor in the state's post-civil rights era, and a staunch Democrat. Siegelman was a potential 2004 presidential candidate. His politics put him in the crosshairs of insurgent Republicans, both within the state and nationally. He was indicted wrongfully, according to scores of attorneys general from states across the nation, convicted and given a harsh prison sentence by a prosecutor and judge with links to GOP operative Karl Rove. The case was the subject of a CBS 60 Minutes report and a documentary film. Siegelman served 5 years in federal prison, including long stretches in solitary confinement before being released on probation. We're going to talk about his new book, Stealing Our Democracy: How the Political Assassination of a Governor Threatens Our Nation. You know, it's 10 years since you were on the show last. It's great to have you back. It's great to have you out.
Yeah, I would have been back on your show much earlier if I hadn't been derailed by the federal government. So my apologies, but yeah.
You got a good excuse.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, they wouldn't. I tried to get on one radio show and they put me in solitary confinement for 59 days, I think. And then I talked to the Washington Post and they put me back in solitary confinement. This was after I specifically got permission from the prison counselor to speak to the Washington Post, and they didn't like what I said, so they put me back in solitary confinement. But look, I am not complaining. Before the show started, I told you I felt like I'd earned a degree in criminal justice, and what I have learned, you know, I just want to. Let me give your listeners a little bit of my background so, you know, they understand where I came from and how I ended up being the person I am and how I was able to win offices in this blood red state of Alabama and why I was targeted. All of which is included in part in my book, by the way. But fortunately, Rob, I was raised by two wonderful parents and had the opportunity to talk politics and religion with my mom and dad, and I you know, was confronted with racial and religious prejudice, and we were, you know, I grew up in an atmosphere where segregation was the standard operating procedure, and in high school we faced the first order for integration, and then in college, George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door to prevent blacks from entering. And we had battles with Wallace back then over his attempt to take over the school system, all school systems in Alabama. And I went on to Georgetown Law School, worked for Congressman Allard Lowenstein from New York, and I'd been involved in the anti-war movement. I kind of described myself as an anti-war Jane Fonda, Robert Kennedy Democrat. And, you know, I was elected to the National Board of Americans for Democratic Action, which is a national liberal organization, back in 1971. I had worked for Charles Evers, who was Medgar Evers' brother when he was running for governor of Mississippi in 1971.
You were really young then. I mean, you were like 24 years old, something like that?
Yeah, 24, 28. And then when I came back to Alabama, I went to Oxford for a period of time, came back to Alabama because I wanted to make a difference. And I started working for the chairman of the Democratic Party, who was a liberal Democrat, and we had another battle with Governor Wallace when he tried to take over the Democratic Party to use it as a springboard to run for president again. But the point I want to make here is that I am a left-leaning, far left-leaning Democrat with credentials to prove it. Yet I was able to be elected to the top 4 offices. I was the longest running elected Democrat in the Southeast because I related to people. I talked to people. I met them, and I talked about their needs and their concerns and ways to move themselves, their children, and the state forward. And we were able to accomplish a great deal. As Congressman John Lewis points out in my book, he picked up on this. He said the coup de grace, it wasn't when I had appointed more African Americans and women to judgeships than any other governor before or since, but it was when I proposed to give free early learning and free college education to all of Alabama's children. That John Lewis felt like that was when, everything hit the fan. But
maybe that's where Bernie Sanders got the idea from you.
Well, he may have, but let me tell you, there was something that Bryan Stevenson said. Bryan Stevenson is a young Black political lawyer, activist, civil rights lawyer who's been fighting for justice for people on death row since he got out of law school, before he got out of law school at Harvard. But he's in Montgomery. But he said, without hope, there is no chance for us to move forward. And what I wanted to do with education is what actually needs to be done now. Every child in this country, regardless of where they're born or to whom or the color of their skin, regardless of their family's economic status, regardless of whether they're immigrants or citizens, every child should have the ability to reach their God-given potential through education. And furthermore, and that's where early learning comes in. Secondly, we've got to give children the hope and belief and the dream that if they stay in school and make their grades and stay out of trouble, that they can go on and get additional job training to go to work at one of Alabama's 5 automobile plants. They could get training to work at Lockheed Martin or Boeing's rocket centers in Alabama. They could go on to be an engineer if they want to. And we could have paid for that. We could have paid for that with an education lottery like Georgia has. And, I was targeted for 2 reasons. One, I had been touted by some as a dark horse candidate. The Kiplinger letter on March 28th, 2001 wrote that, guys, look out for Siegelman in Alabama because he could do, what Carter and Clinton did and break the Republican stronghold on the South. And the second reason I was targeted is because I was proposing this education lottery to be followed by an option of cities to vote on casinos, which would have destroyed the monopoly that the Choctaw Indians had in Mississippi. And that's where Jack Abramoff and another group of Karl Rove cronies, Ralph Reed and Grover Norquist, came in. They laundered $20 million of Indian casino money into the state to defeat me and to defeat my education lottery proposal. So,
but it wasn't that defeated you. It was vote theft.
It was what?
It was vote theft.
Oh yeah, well that they couldn't beat me, as there was a Republican Attorney General from Arizona, Grant Woods, who was on 60 Minutes, and Scott Pelley asked him, what happened, and he said, well, Siegelman was the one Democrat in Alabama that they couldn't beat fair and square, so they targeted him with this prosecution. But before the prosecution was the ballot theft, as you put it, in 2002. And it is absolutely clear that my election was stolen. The night of the election, I was declared the winner. the poll workers and party officials and the media were sent out of the courthouse. And within a span of 3 minutes, there was another capitulation of votes, and 6,200 of my votes simply disappeared, were subtracted from my total, and it did not impact a single down ballot race. So that it clearly was something was wrong. So
Is
I
it
called.
something that could still happen now?
Oh, more prevalent now. This was in 2002. Hacking, computer hacking was just probably just getting started. But good Lord, yes, and that's why, you know, work being done on ballot security is a very important issue going into 2020.
Yeah, you've been screwed in a lot of ways.
That's funny that you said it in those words. John Grisham, when asked last Thursday, we were talking about whether he was going to write a sequel to The Innocent Man, and he started talking about the number of wrongful convictions, and the interviewer said that they were about to host me on June the 18th, and she said, "What do you think about the Siegelman case?" And he said, "Oh, he got screwed." Excuse me. I've got some spray.
Here you go. Okay.
Thank you.
Did. You mean, and I think it's like you said, because you could have been the president of the United States.
I could have competed. At the time I was first attracted, well, I was fed up with George W. Bush's war policies, his economic policies, and his education policies. They were all, in my judgment, wrong and a failure. And I was ready to enter the Democratic primaries, and I called.
What year was that?
This was 2001 when I was looking at it. And as I was getting ready for my reelection in 2002, the election for president would have been in 2004. You know, the primary season would have been heating up the next year, 2003. So anyway, getting back to the point we were talking about earlier, as I was beginning to make my way into the 2002 race, an investigation was started by Karl Rove's client, the state attorney general. My election was stolen in large part by Karl Rove's client, the state attorney general, who was rewarded and put on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Interestingly, Jeff Sessions, who participated in getting my hanging judge appointed, said that we would have gotten Bill Pryor, the state attorney general, Karl Rove's client, appointed to the bench earlier, but we needed a Republican governor in place first. During this time, from the beginning of the state investigation by Karl Rove's client to the time the election was stolen, George W. Bush had been elected in 2000 under questionable circumstances, as we know, and ballot theft in Florida. And a new U.S. attorney was appointed with ties to Karl Rove. I'm going to back up just a little bit. After the 1992 race for president of George Hubert Walker Bush and the Bush Quayle ticket that went down to Clinton Gore, Karl Rove and his sidekick, his buddy, a guy that had worked in the White House, Billy Canary, both left Washington and went to Texas, and then came to Alabama to set up his political shop. This is where it was in Alabama that Karl Rove rejuvenated his political strength. He and Billy Canary convinced the business community that the business community should pay them to help take over the Alabama Supreme Court on behalf of business interests, the way Rove had participated in Texas. And they did. They started that process.
One thing now, what I'm hearing is the level of planning and strategization of dealing with the judiciary among the Republicans. It looks like it totally blows away what we see from the Democrats. I mean, I don't see any kind of strategic approaches to the judiciary from the Democrats.
No, there was, and well, you could look back when President Obama was elected, he had control of both houses, both the Senate and the House, and there was no effort to push through, his moderate nominees. They weren't liberals, they were moderates. He was looking for common ground from the moment he lowered his right hand from taking the oath of office. So no, the Democrats have always been the one who the party that turns the other cheek, and
I gotta say, it's not beyond turning the other cheek. It's just dumb and lack of vision. The Republicans look at the courts and the power of the courts and the influence of the courts. Look what they did to you. They derailed you running for governor. They derailed you as look. The Democrats ended up with a Massachusetts guy who brought nothing to the election with John Kerry. And you could have maybe brought the South, maybe brought Alabama, and Bush would have easily been beaten if you had not been taken out by the justice, by the judiciary.
Well, and you may have had it right the first time. The justice system, or the Department of Justice, represented by Karl Rove and George W. Bush. They had Alberto Gonzales as the Attorney General. They took out 7 Republican U.S. attorneys who were not performing politically as Karl Rove wanted them to, and they rewarded U.S. attorneys like the ones that came after me. Karl Rove admits that he interviewed or reviewed the credentials of every single potential appointee as a district court or U.S. appellate court judge and U.S. attorneys. They carefully vetted those people so that they would be all Federalist and all generally in an ideological framework that supported what Rove was trying to do.
Now, if I were you, I would not be a big fan of Obama. He had the opportunity to pardon you, and he should have. I always thought he would, and he didn't. But yeah. So why didn't he?
Well, that's a question I have asked myself and others. He had I thought a perfect opportunity after he and Eric Holder intervened in the case of the Republican U.S. Senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens, in his case, Judge Emmett Sullivan, the same judge that's going to be looking at Michael Flynn's sentencing and his guilty plea and whether he's going to allow him to withdraw it. And, but the Emmett Sullivan's, when looking at the Ted Stevens case, said it was the worst case of prosecutorial misconduct that he had seen in his time on the bench, or something to some words to that effect. And so they dismissed the charges against Governor Stevens after he lost the election and subsequently was killed in a plane crash. But in my case, is as you can tell from my nonfiction, hard-hitting political expose, we've got 152 legal notes in the back that details the government bad faith and misconduct, which far outweighed anything that happened to Ted Stevens. So President Obama had an opportunity to do the right thing early on and did not. So one says, well, why not? I've asked that question, and there was one character at the Department of Justice, David Margolis, who had worked there longer than anybody else. And he was a confidant of all U.S. attorneys general. He had worked with Eric Holder when Eric Holder worked at the Department of Justice. I think Eric Holder showed deference to David Margolis. And Margolis was involved with Karl Rove in the dismissal of the U.S. attorneys in 2006 and participated in helping to select, as I understand it, helping to select their replacements. He crossed the line politically from being a DOJ employee into a political operative of Karl Rove's, in my judgment. And he raised questions with Dick Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse, who were also shocked at his behavior. He was the person who approved this first the first case against me. So let me back up. Okay, so my election is stolen. And I immediately say, okay, guys, you won't let me have a recount because Karl Rove's client has absconded. The attorney general seized the ballots the next day. Illegally, seized the ballots and everything that had to do with the election in Baldwin County, this one county controlled by Republicans. Took everything to Montgomery, never to be seen again. So it totally thwarted any effort that we had to get a recount. So I said, okay,
But wait, because this was not a one-off. This has happened in other places too, right?
Well, all I know is it happened in my case. I watched Karl Rove.
It happened in Wisconsin too.
Yeah, in other states, yes. Yeah. This
is a strategy that has been used successfully, repeatedly by the Republicans.
And I would, recently Karl Rove was summoned to the White House by President Bush. By President Trump. It's easy sometimes to get them confused, but actually Bush looks really good compared to Trump. But it's interesting that Donald Trump has made amends with Karl Rove, who called him a moron. And so now we have Trump with this mastermind of dirty tricks. Karl Rove worked in the Nixon White House with Don Segretti in the dirty tricks department and came within a hair of getting called in by the FBI. If it hadn't been for George Hubert Walker Bush, he might have been indicted back with the rest of the crew back in 1993 and 4. But so now you've got a partnership of Trump and Rove. And Rove knows how to...
Trump and Rove?
Trump and Rove.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh. So we had better... Democrats, they had a chance to hold Karl Rove accountable in the Obama administration.
Yeah, Obama looked forward, not back.
Right. When he said that, I thought, oh, my God. That meant we're not going to look at how we were led into a war under false pretenses. That meant we weren't going to look at how the U.S. engaged in torture. We weren't going to look at the Patriot Act. We weren't going to look at the illegal assassinations. And we weren't going to look at stolen elections. We weren't going to look at people who have been targeted for prosecution by a corrupt Department of Justice.
But we were going to look at whistleblowers, and we were going to prosecute more whistleblowers than any president, all the other presidents combined. Obama.
And also one other thing, remember he also promised to be the most transparent president. He even mentioned the Freedom of Information Act. He has the worst record probably of any president in terms of providing information through the Freedom of Information Act. We sued the Department of Justice for information relating to my prosecution under the Freedom of Information Act initially in 2006. My son took over the case, and finally in 2018, 12 years later, we win the only case that was won against the Obama administration to divulge information. And of course, the Department of Justice redacted everything of interest in the file that we were looking for. But one interesting point here.
But wait, we need to do a show ID now, so just give a second, okay?
Yes, sir.
So you got a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, but it had nothing in it.
Well, the only thing we got out of it was the federal judge said that the Department of Justice had engaged in bad faith. So, so what? We didn't get the information, but the Project on Governmental Oversight published a letter which a anonymous whistleblower produced. The whistleblower came from the House Judiciary Committee staff and produced a letter where the Department of Justice had written John Conyers a sealed letter saying there was no political motivation in my case, ... But they did find that the prosecutor leading my investigation was in email communication with my Republican opponent's campaign manager, and that he had said how frustrated he was that the investigation wasn't moving fast enough, and that he and a group of like-minded conservative prosecutors were doing everything they could. Well, that's in a letter from the Department of Justice. They admit that going back as far as December the 2nd, 2002, I think I've got those dates right, I know I have the year right, that the prosecutor leading the investigation was in email communication with my Republican opponent. I was subsequently brought to trial in 2004 in a case where this one federal judge, U.W. Clemens, said that it was the most unfounded criminal case over which he had presided in his 29 years and 7 months on the bench. And he asked the Department of Justice to dismiss the case with prejudice. That same attorney who was in email communication with my Republican opponent's campaign manager was the lead prosecutor in that case. One other interesting point, in the back of the courtroom sat two other people. One was a prosecutor in the Middle District working for a Karl Rove connected prosecutor. And the other was a retired FBI agent who had worked for Jeff Sessions. If on the flip side of my book, you'll notice there's a picture of Jeff Sessions. Karl Rove, Jeff Sessions, and Donald Trump. Yeah. There he is over on the right. The reason why he is there is because once I announced in 2003 that I was going to run for re-election in 2006, the wheels, this Rove-related group of Republicans got busy again. And the U.S. attorney, who was married to Karl Rove's business partner, Billy Canary, all right, so, they came to Alabama in 1992. They started up their political practice. Karl Rove and Billy Canary both married girls from Alabama. Karl Rove settled on the Gulf Coast at Rosemary Beach, and Billy Canary settled in Montgomery. They continued their business practice in Alabama, where Karl Rove went back to Texas and got involved in George W. Bush's campaign for governor. But they were still running these campaigns out of Alabama. So in 2003, after my election had been stolen and the Republican had been named the winner, he proposed a property tax proposal that even the state Republican Party opposed, which it'd have to be bad for that to happen, right? Well, his popularity dropped, and political surveys showed me beating the Republican Bob Riley in a head-to-head contest in 2006 by like a 2-to-1 margin.
Wow.
So the Republican Party chairman then went to Washington to talk to Jeff Sessions and about running against me in 2006 because he was the strongest Republican in Alabama. It was then that Jeff Sessions retired FBI agents. Keep in mind, Jeff Sessions was a U.S. attorney in Mobile, South Alabama, before he entered state politics, became attorney general, then U.S. senator. His retired FBI agents were the ones who built the case against me. They got cross-designated by the state and the U.S. attorney, both connected to Karl Rove. State Attorney General, Karl Rove's client, U.S. attorney, the wife of Karl Rove's business partner.
So what we've got is a picture where the worms are so deep, the snakes are wrapped so tightly around the heart of democracy in Alabama that they were going after you in 1,000 different ways, using all these connections and all these powers. I mean, because, you get into the details and it can go on and on. I know you got a whole lot of it in the book, and it's fascinating the way you tell it. But I also want to get into how you put time in jail. You learn stuff there. And I really want to hear about Karl Rove and Trump. I mean, what can you tell us about Karl Rove and Trump? I think that's really something.
Well, I think, frankly, I think the connection is this. Karl Rove clearly was involved in the Florida election in 2000, in which Bush was named the winner and Al Gore election was snatched from him.
Where Bush was appointed president by the Supreme Court.
Right. But they were engaged in ballot suppression and ballot theft even back then in 2000 in Florida. In 1994, I was lieutenant governor. I had been Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, and that was my first encounter with Rove and Billy Canary in 1994 when they were trying to steal. I say steal, and did steal, in my judgment, the election for Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. And the way they did that was by suppressing legally cast absentee ballots. And I could argue that point, and I did in federal court, and I lost, and they won. And those legal
Probably a Republican appointed judge you were arguing to.
Exactly. Oh, God, yes. Republican appointed federal judge that I was arguing to. That 2,000 votes, absentee ballots, should be counted. They were thrown out, and that swung the election to the Republican. But so now we have this marriage between Trump and Rove. Rove is astute at this process. They know how to do this. Now, whether Karl Rove was the one who authorized the hacking of my election in 2002, I don't know. But I do know this. Because I had a conversation with the Republican Party chairman, who was party chairman during the time that my election was stolen. And he told me that sitting across from his desk that night was a person who was keeping up precinct by precinct the election returns as they were coming in, and the other person was Karl Rove's associate who was in Alabama to help them get this Republican elected governor. Her name was Kitty McCullough, changed her name to Kelly Kimbrough, and now I think her name is Kelly Kimbrough or Kelly McCullough Robertson. But immediately after my election, she went back to the White House to continue working with Karl Rove and George W. Bush. There were two people who were given credit or took credit. One was Kitty McCullough, the Rove operative, the White House operative who was in Alabama that night. And secondly,
so basically you're saying she was there to help steal the election from you.
I don't know, but all I know is that she was there when they targeted Baldwin County and the vote switched after that in Baldwin County. There was an election security expert who was working for my Republican opponent, and he purportedly or reportedly was actually in Baldwin County at the night of the election, was seen there in the vicinity of the courthouse with his computer. But so we have, and immediately after the election, he went to work for Jack Abramoff, Tom DeLay related company, the Alexandria Group. But
let me step in a second. So I want to get an idea what you think Rove is doing now with Trump. What can we imagine he's up to?
I think he is there for quote ballot security reasons, and that means, does that mean ballot theft? Does that mean ballot suppression? Does that mean the suppression of black votes? Does that mean this systematic suppression of Democratic votes from Democratic districts? Does that mean a really tightly secured election day process where every ballots from Democratic districts are going to be challenged so that they votes for Trump will come in, Democratic votes will be challenged, and they will examine every single absentee ballot to try to throw out as many as they can. This was what they did in Florida. This is what they did in my case in Alabama. Well, they tried to do it, and they did it in 1994 in the Supreme Court race. So if you're asking me what Trump is up to with Karl Rove, I think Rove is there to help him secure the election in 2020, probably by challenging absentee ballots.
And this election cycle, because of coronavirus, millions more people are going to be using absentee ballots than ever before in history.
Absolutely. And that's why I think he's there. I think he's there. He will develop an election day strategy where there will be Republican lawyers at every courthouse, if not at every precinct. And they will be in most places, absentee ballots go into a central place in the county courthouse. And at some point in Alabama, it's 12 noon on election day, they begin opening the ballots and beginning the process of counting and or challenging the absentee ballots. You can expect in every courthouse, in every county in this country, there will be Republican lawyers tied into Rove and Trump who will be there for the sole purpose of challenging ballots coming in from Democratic districts.
Wow. So, we don't have that much time left, and I want to make sure we cover a lot more. You spent 5 years in jail. What did you learn there?
I learned that African American men of color are targeted by the government. I learned that the government gets 99% of the indictments they seek. 99%. That's a pretty phenomenal average. If you were going to a casino, winning 99% of the time, they wouldn't let you in the door. Well, there's a reason why the government gets 99% of the indictments they seek, and it's because grand juries are in secret. They're secret proceedings where there is no judge and there is no lawyer for the target. And let me bring this home to George Floyd and what's going on, because one of my proposals that I am doing everything I can at this point, even today, trying to work my friends in the House and U.S. House and Senate, is I want to go before the House or Senate or both judiciary committees to talk about how we can best ensure fairness in the examination of the conduct of police who use excessive force, resulting in injury or death to, let's say, African Americans, specifically in this case, George Floyd or Aubrey, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, or any of these other, or Eric Gardner in New York. You know, people, historically, prosecutors no bill, what they call no bill, that means that they do not return an indictment against a police officer. Well, in my case, if I had had a lawyer present during the grand jury process, I would have never been indicted, because the prosecutors, the guy that was emailing my Republican opponent's campaign manager, presented false evidence and suborned testimony in order to get the indictment. So if the victim's family had an opportunity to have a lawyer present in the grand jury, they could keep a check on truth. They could make sure that the grand jury received all of the evidence that was available. They could object to evidence that the prosecutor was going to present. And let me mention this.
So you're saying that in grand jury hearings, people should have a right to an attorney?
Correct. Yeah. In a civil deposition, Rob, lawyers have a chance to object to proposed testimony or evidence, and a judge decides. And that's in a case where monetary damages are at stake. Here we're talking about somebody's life, their freedom. Surely in this situation, it's even more incumbent upon Congress to ensure that lawyers can be present at that critical stage of the criminal proceeding. This is where prosecutors can let the guilty walk free, or they can charge an innocent person with a crime. And once they're indicted, 97% plead guilty. Why? Because prosecutors say, well, if you don't, you know, we can charge your mother, your brother, your son, your cousin in this conspiracy. So do you want, or we can increase the proposed range from 10 years to 25 years to life. What do you want to do? They plead guilty. So we've got to get a handle on this one part of our criminal justice system. There are lots of things we can do.
Now, how does that apply to George Floyd?
Well, it may not apply to George Floyd, because there's already been such a spotlight on the misbehavior of the police in this case,
and the district attorney for the county. If
there was no video, and if there was only the word of the bystanders and the police, and if the district attorney is presenting this case to a grand jury, prosecutors can and do willfully and intentionally present false evidence, false testimony, and withhold exculpatory evidence. The chief of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence is epidemic in America.
Exculpatory evidence
is evidence that would tend to prove that the defendant is not guilty.
Okay.
So they withhold that. Let me give you.
We've got a pandemic of injustice happening with grand juries and prosecutors.
Correct. and it needs, we can at least begin to turn it around by requiring that the target and the victim's family have the right to a lawyer present, and the objections to evidence or testimony be handled in the same way that civil depositions are handled.
Why is that not the case? How can that be?
Well, how can it be that the United States Supreme Court in 1976 gave blanket immunity, absolute immunity, to prosecutors, even if they willfully lie or present false testimony or withhold exculpatory evidence? I'm not making this stuff up. Let me give you another example. President Obama's lawyer. This was on January the 4th, 2010, the Los Angeles Times reported by David Savage, their legal correspondent, that President Obama's lawyer argued to the Supreme Court yesterday that United States citizens, quote, do not have a constitutional right not to be framed. U.S. citizens can be framed by prosecutors and you can't sue them. Why? Because it's enshrined in a Supreme Court decision in 1976 and also in the Federal Tort Claims Act that Congress passed. We've got to, I want to get Congress's attention to get this one small piece of our criminal justice, the broken part of our criminal justice system, fixed. Second thing,
so we need to take a break again, and then when we come back, I want to talk more about how we need to fix the criminal justice system. And my guest for this show is Don Seigelman. He's the only politician in Alabama history to hold all the state's top constitutional offices: governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and secretary of state. He has been through hell, prosecuted and convicted and put in jail for things he never did because of the instigations of Karl Rove. He's got a new book out now, Stealing Our Democracy: How the Political Assassination of a Governor Threatens Our Nation. And we've been talking about the problems that we have with our justice system. So tell me more about your thoughts of how we fix the justice system. I mean, you said our justice system is broken, that justice reform should be part of the presidential debate, and that you want a president who understands that our system of justice is capable of political abuse, who wants to right wrongs and fix our justice system.
I think it's, I think it's critical and it's timely. Both my book and my advocacy for criminal justice reform happens at a time when the nation is focused on the injustices, particularly perpetrated upon men and women of color in this country. And I have looked at this, studied it, and I'll give you another little bit of history. I was a Capitol Hill policeman in Washington, D.C. for about 3 weeks, and then took a job at the Justice Department in the civil rights section of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, looking at police, the abuse of power by police and National Guardsmen as it related to the shooting of demonstrators and anti-war demonstrators back in the 1970s at Kent State and Jackson State and other parts of the country. So I've been thinking about this issue for a long time. And then when I was in prison for 5 years, I had an opportunity to look at it from a close vantage point. And I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of inmates about what they did, how they were convicted, how long they were sentenced. And I wrote
when you were in prison?
I'm sorry?
When you were in prison?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I spent a lot of time talking and writing and trying to help other inmates. And one of them was a guy named Juan Garcia. I've got a chapter in the book called Saving Juan Garcia. This is just one example. There are hundreds, but he was convicted in I think it's 1994 and 1997 of a half ounce of marijuana or more. And he was charged with a felony, put on probation. Then in 1999, he was convicted on another marijuana charge, no amount given. And he was what they call careered out. He was given 25 years, 3 strikes and you're out. You get 25 years in prison. I asked him, he was my bunkmate sleeping upstairs, one bunk up. And
you were in a room with 21 by 21 with 20 people in it?
We had 21 people in the room, and there were 3 bunks high. And they were so close together you could reach out and touch the bunks on either side. There was not enough room to sit up in the beds, and that's why we called it the submarine room, because you only had one door to get in, one door to get out, and no windows. But anyway, so Garcia had been in for 19 years before I was able to write a petition and get him out on a commutation. But that. We don't think about this, this war on crimes, war on drugs, really a war on black people, and this is being picked up by the media now. But there's just so much injustice and so much overkill. When our mentality, when we became frightened back in the late 70s, early 80s, and Ronald Reagan, and actually started before that with Nixon, with law and order, and preaching that we've got to put these people in jail for a long period of time. And then Clinton, of course, passed the 3 strikes and you're out law. But we've been, prosecutors took to their job with unparalleled zest, and they sought the longest sentences possible and convictions by any means necessary, which meant if they presented false evidence in grand juries to get a conviction, so be it. They were immune, and are immune from civil liability. So that's part of the discussion that's going on now and will go on, is ending this qualified immunity of police officers. And what I want to do is
end qualified immunity of the prosecutors too.
Right. And that's part of my proposal. So we put a lawyer in the grand jury. We make all investigators and prosecutors record any interviews with witnesses or targets, and those recordings turned over to the defense, so we can at least deter the attempts to threaten and cajole and pressure witnesses to lie on behalf of the government. Let me go back to my case. Let me go back to take you to 60 Minutes, February the 20th.
We've got 2 minutes left.
Okay.
So figure out what you want to say that in 2 minutes to get your message out.
Well, my message is that we've got to fix the justice system. It can be done. It's important. We've got to take it on. My book, Stealing Our Democracy, lays out a plan. It's a call to action. It's a no holds barred book that lays it all open for people to see. It's raw and it's
fascinating ugly. Book with a lot of stories in it that illustrate your message too.
And I think it's an interesting picture of political history in the South particularly, but it ranges from Alabama to Long Island to London or Oxford to back to Alabama. So yeah, I think I've been told it's a page turner. We've gotten a number of great reviews, and it's currently trending #1 on among Amazon's new releases. So if people buy this book and read it, it's going to give me a better chance to have the credibility that I need to stand before Congress and argue for changes in our justice system.
And what will those change? Give me 3 changes that you want.
3 changes. make sure that targets and the victim's family have a lawyer present in the grand jury, that all testimony of any witness or targets are recorded and turned over to the defense. And third, that we repeal the immunity and make it clear that both abuse of power by police or by prosecutors are subject to civil liability and criminal liability.
All right. My guest for this show has been Don Seigelman. He's the only politician in Alabama history to hold all the state's top constitutional offices: governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and secretary of state. And he went to jail because of the machinations of Karl Rove. And he's out now. He's got a story to tell. He's got a great book, Stealing Our Democracy. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, Rob. Thank you. Good to see you again.
Absolutely.